I'm going to depart from my normal procedure, which is to not prepare remarks, because I like not to know what I'm going to say. But Hitch was too important to give out random words, so I've actually prepared some remarks. Christopher Hitchens was my friend. And even as I say those words, I'm amazed. Every time I used to leave his apartment, usually pretty drunk, I'd walk out the door in amazement and I'd say, Christopher Hitchens is my friend. What did I do to deserve this? Why on earth would he want to spend time with me? Shortly after his death, I was interviewed on CNN by a cloying and annoying interviewer who tried to suggest that she was intimately familiar with him by calling him Chris on every occasion. And if you knew anything about Christopher, you knew that he'd immediately tell you his name was not Chris. Anyway, I just forced myself to watch it to see how she introduced him. And she said, on the one hand, he inspired the ideals of skepticism, free inquiry, and rational thought in many. But at the same time, he has been called a bullying, lying, opportunistic, cynical contrarian. And she said that as if it was a bad thing. Christopher was a beacon of knowledge and light in a world that constantly threatens to extinguish both. He had the courage to accept the world for just what it is and not what he wanted it to be. That's the highest praise I believe one can give any intellect. He understood that the universe doesn't care about our existence or our welfare, and he epitomized the realization that our lives have meaning only to the extent that we give them meaning. For Christopher, this came through the credo that guided his life, the courageous defense of the simple proposition that skepticism, rather than credulity, is the highest principle that the human intellect can use to ennoble our existence. You can applaud for that. That's his. On a personal level, whenever I spent an evening with Hitch, I came away saying, when I grow up, I want to be an intellectual. The moment you entered his house, you were overwhelmed by a single obsession, books. Books were everywhere, on every surface, on the wall, on the floors, on couches, on tables, and bathrooms. But unlike for many of us, myself included, the books on Christopher's wall were far more than window dressing. They were arranged according to subjects and ideas in a way that made it clear that the books were regularly read, all of them, and consulted, that the knowledge contained within them was used in a sense that few of us really adequately exploit. It was humbling to witness close up an intellect that was so capable of surrounding any subject, relishing it, exploring it for its own sake, critically soaking up everything that's worth knowing. He was ever ready to incorporate this wisdom to shed light on old ideas or critically examining new ones with the full weight of a lifetime of intellectual exploration combined with the playful and curious excitement of a child in a candy store. He embodied the delicious possibilities of existence and the profound sense of satisfaction that intellectual exploration, integrity, and bravery can bring, especially when confronting power with knowledge, even as he openly recognized that the possibility of a successful outcome in any such battle is always slim. Those are the two features that were most crucial to what I admired about the man. It takes courage to speak out against injustice and ignorance wherever you see it, no matter whose sensibilities you ruffle. But it takes far more courage to do that when you realize that the odds are overwhelming that you will lose, that stupidity, prejudice, superstition, hatred, power, and money generally win. But it doesn't matter. You can't give up. But that second feature, that unadulterated joy of ideas and the human experience, the need for irony and humor, and the recourse to the full banquet of human knowledge and culture that set Hitch apart from so many of the rest of us. Charm and wit, when combined with actual knowledge, is not to be underrated. Since his death, I've been told by many people that that's the greatest loss to the cause of reason that brings all of us here today. I have to say personally, that's what guides me. I remember on the day he died, I told myself that to whatever small extent I could emulate any of those qualities in my own work, to keep the candle of joy and wonder and irony that he kept burning, I dedicate my life to that task. And many's a day when I think, how would I want to present something? And I'm guided by that simple question that so many religious people ask in their lives, but I change the wording, and I ask, what would Christopher do? The last time I saw him, our discussions ranged from subjects relating to the nature of nothingness, quantum mechanics, and the obscenity that is capital punishment, the madness that governs the religious fanaticism infecting both sides of the Middle East conflict, the embarrassment that is Catholicism, and a related subject, the intellectual laziness and pretentious nonsense that encompasses so much of religious faith and theological noise in our popular culture. Christopher was not a scientist, but he was fascinated by the power of science, not merely its possible impact on human affairs, but more importantly for him and for me, the remarkable ideas that it generates. He was wise enough to recognize that the universe is far more imaginative than we are. And as one who craved experience of all aspects of intellectual life, he was eager to learn from the universe, as he was from the oeuvre of the world's greatest writers, philosophers, and historians. On the last day I was with him, someone came to the door and I answered it for Christopher, and the person delivered a manuscript and asked if I was his manager or his agent. I said, no, I'm his personal physicist. I can think of very few greater honors that I would bestow upon myself than that, in fact. Through his questions and reflections, he extended my own understanding and implications of my own work. Just yesterday, I described how when musing on the material I talked about, he described how nothingness is heading straight towards us as fast as it can. That idea didn't terrify him. He realized that knowledge is not to be gained for comforting our souls, but for enhancing the awareness of being alive. There are two personal aspects of Christopher that may not be apparent to a broader audience, and I want to spend a minute on each. First, what I found so refreshing about talking to the man is that one could never be quite sure about what he'd say about any given subject. For many of us, when we meet like-minded friends, we can remain complacent in the knowledge that we're pretty sure they'll agree with us, or at least we know what they're going to say. But Christopher approached each subject in its own context, not in the context of liberalism or atheism or any ism. We debated the Iraq War late into the night, and we never agreed. But that leads to the other quality I admired so much in him, his incredible tolerance. Now, tolerance might not be the word that the public associated with him listening to him in his public appearances. He had no tolerance for nonsense, for lying, posturing, and he was brave enough to attack even the self-serving, pious evildoers like Mother Teresa, or popular liberal presidents like Bill Clinton, even when it set him apart from popular myths. But on a personal level, he separated ideas from individuals. He had close friends with whom he was diametrically opposed. Francis Collins, a friend of both of ours, is head of the National Institutes of Health. His religious ideas border on the nutty, if you ever listen to them. But not only was he a close friend of Christopher's, in fact, he helped him tremendously in the last months of his life, and he served, in fact, as his medical advisor and friend. Justice Antonin Scalia, who's one of the bastions of evil on the Supreme Court in the United States right now, was nevertheless a regular guest at the Hitchens' home. And I know his personal company was enjoyed by both Hitch and Carol on a regular basis. Being able to befriend and charm even your intellectual enemies is something we can all learn from. We can all emulate as we try to bring the light of reason into a world which so often shuts it out. It requires courage and self-confidence combined with the ability to simply enjoy people as people. I want to come close to the end with a bit of advice which he gave, and I think it's particularly pertinent to this meeting. In his book, Letters to a Young Contrarian, he said, "We are an adaptable species, and this adaptability has enabled us to survive. However, adaptability can also constitute a threat. We may become habituated to certain dangers and fail to recognize them until it is too late. You exist at the whim of people whose power does not derive from your consent, and who regard you as expendable and disposable. You merely fail to notice the moment at which you were conscripted. A normal life consists in living as if this most salient of facts was not a fact at all. Try your hardest to combat atrophy and routine. To question the obvious and the given is an essential element of the maximum de omnibus dubitandum. Doubt everything." In that regard, just before leaving his company on that last day we were together, in one of those poetic accidents that makes life so unexpectedly enjoyable, I was reading a newspaper at his kitchen table, and I was reading about an emerging effort to ensure that young people at elite institutions preserve their Catholic upbringings during and after college. In the last sentence, when describing the temptations to depart from piety, the author wrote, "Exposed to Nietzsche, Hitchens, co-ed dorms, and beer pong, such students are expected to stray." I reflected on what a remarkable tribute to the man this simple sentence represented. To be so overpowering in one's cultural impact that one can be mentioned without explanation is one thing. But to be sandwiched between Nietzsche and beer pong, that's an honor that very few of us can hope to achieve. And it's perhaps the greatest way that Christopher would want to be remembered. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Lawrence, the concept of quantum gravity is a hot topic among physicists. I want to understand why and why it's so important to unify quantum mechanics and relativity, and what are people doing about it?
Well, at some level, it's one of the most fundamental, outstanding questions in physics, because it takes two ideas which are both strange and puts them together to make something that's doubly strange. General relativity told us that space and time are not at all what they seem to be. That our presence changes space. Space itself, which we think of as the stage on which we exist, is dynamical. It itself can evolve. And we curve space just by being here talking. And we change time by being here talking. And that perception changed our view of the stage on which we exist more than perhaps almost any other development in physics. But the other development in physics that changed our perception of the universe is quantum mechanics, which in many ways is even stranger than gravity. Gravity, well, the fact that space is curved may seem strange, but you can comprehend it classically. You can think of this tablecloth curving as I lift it up. That we can picture. Quantum mechanics is so strange that we can't even intuit it. The truths of quantum mechanics are clearly false in our perception. The fact that this coffee cup is here is something we classically understand. But quantum mechanically, we can know that coffee cup is not just there. And in fact, the particles in that coffee cup are not just sitting there doing a single thing. They're doing many different things at the same time. And the truths of quantum mechanics are so strange that we will never intuit them, no matter how advanced we become as a civilization, because we are classical objects. We can't ever directly experience the phenomena, or at least rarely experience directly the phenomena that the mathematics of quantum mechanics tells us are true. Well, not only are both those strange, but it turns out general relativity and quantum mechanics are incompatible mathematically. That when you try and apply the laws of quantum mechanics to the dynamics of space and time, you come up with nonsense, mathematical nonsense. And therefore, since these are sort of the two greatest intellectual pillars of what was 20th century physics, it is one of the greatest challenges for physicists to try and put them together. That being said, what one should point out,
and this is true even though relativity deals with the macro, huge structure of the universe, and quantum mechanics deals with the micro structure of atoms and subatomic particles, you still need to put them together, even though they're different scales.
It's a really good question, because in fact, in principle, you might say, well, that's just an esoteric question. It really doesn't matter. At very small scales, quantum mechanics and gravity must be put together to understand them, but who really cares? And I was just going to say, in some sense, for most of our understanding of the universe, understanding quantum gravity is irrelevant.
Right.
It really is. We can understand almost all of nature without ever understanding quantum gravity. So while it's a fundamental theoretical question, it's not an obstacle to understanding the way much of the universe works, except for one thing that makes it interesting, more interesting, is that the universe is expanding. And what is very large now, at the very beginning, was very small. And if we really want to answer that important question, is how do we get here and why, or what caused the beginning of the universe? Was there something before the beginning? All those fascinating questions. At some point, we're stuck, because if we extrapolate back the universe, we know that the laws of physics hold back to the time of our entire observable universe. All the 400 billion galaxies we see were contained in regions smaller than the size of an atom.
Right.
But when you get smaller still, even that point we can understand it. But when you get smaller still, and really want to get to the very beginning, then we have to know how quantum mechanics and gravity work together, because gravity is what describes the universe on its largest scales, which at that time will be that big. Quantum mechanics describes on the smallest scales, which at that time will be that big.
So at that point, it's the same scale.
It's the same scale, and we really can never truly answer that fundamental question. And that's why, in some sense, there's this cosmic imperative to understand that theory. And perhaps only in that sense will we really have a pressing need to understand quantum gravity. Of course, theoretical physicists want to solve paradoxes. Then that was behind a lot of what Einstein did. And so even if it weren't for that, there'd be people who'd be still trying to understand how the world works on fundamental scales. And I think it's always important to continue to ask those questions, because you never know where the answers are going to take you.
Yeah, but what we're saying now is, though, in addition to the purely physical joy of understanding a paradox, we're now dealing with, you really want to take it back to the beginning. You have no choice but to integrate them.
Yeah, this is a great place to talk about that. We're at the end of the world here in Iceland, and so we're looking at trying to think about the other end of the world, the very beginning.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
and at the same time, the greatest source of power that we can imagine to explore the regions of quantum mechanics is the early universe. And the early universe, in essence, becomes our gigantic cosmic accelerator that can probe that distance where nothing else can.
Yeah, although we're now coming to realize the limitations of our universe too. The universe is a cosmic laboratory. I mean, I got involved in this interface between cosmology and particle physics over 20 years ago, because I realized that there are fundamental questions. We'll never be able to build an accelerator large enough to do what the universe did in its earliest moments of beginning. But at the same time, there's a frustration we're learning, and that is, well, when you have an accelerator, you can turn it on and turn it off and do the experiment again and again.
Yeah, it's once.
Our experiment was done once. We only, at least within our accessible, measurable space, we only have one universe. And that may be a fundamental problem to understanding, because in fact, quantum mechanics tells us that to really understand things,
you have
to make, things are probabilistic, and you just have one measurement. It doesn't tell you the whole sense of reality. And so just having one universe may be a fundamental obstacle to ever understanding things.
You've got to create some more.
Well, in fact, yeah, you may have to create universes in the laboratory. We don't know if you can. In fact, one of the interesting things that has come out of physics in the last 10 or 20 years is the growing realization by many people that it's quite likely that there are many universes, but we may have only theoretical access to them. We've already learned, in fact, when we look out at the sky, the cosmic microwave background, the afterglow of the Big Bang, one of the most important observations in cosmology, and won another Nobel Prize last year, in fact. We've already learned that there may be problems, because we've seen some anomalies in that radiation bath, in the way the temperature changes from point to point. Does that point out some new physics? Maybe, maybe not. The reason being that we now think we can understand how all of the galaxies we see in the universe today arose as quantum fluctuations in the early universe, random quantum fluctuations. Well, if they're random and if they're probabilistic, then every now and then you can have something that seems weird. If I flip a coin, every now and then I'll get 12 heads in a row.
Right.
Well, if I flip it a lot of times, I won't see that too often. But if I only flip it 12 times and I happen to get 12 heads in a row, I don't know if the coin is fixed or if it's just an accident. And when we look at some of the fluctuations now that are a little weird, we don't know, because we only have access to one universe, if it's fundamentally weird physics or just an accident of the universe in which we live, which is really kind of a fascinating problem.
There really is, and therefore that imposes sort of a fundamental constraint on how much you possibly can know through this laboratory of the universe.
Absolutely, and as you say, unless we can figure out a way to create universes at will and try and measure this, we may forever be constrained in our knowledge.
What's your confidence in solving quantum gravity in our lifetime?
It's going to be a very difficult problem. There's been a lot of noble effort in the last 30 years to apply a whole set of new mathematical techniques associated with what's called string theory. And so far, there's been no great progress. And so I'm not particularly optimistic that we will have a full theory of quantum gravity, because I suspect what most people, when they think of general relativity, Einstein sitting there thinking in a room, think that that's how science is done, but it's not. We really rely heavily on experiment. And in fact, Einstein did as well. The experimental hints that led into that were very important. He didn't just sit in a closed space thinking about stuff in the middle of nothing. And we really rely on experiment. And this is an area where there really are not going to be many experimental results, and we're going to have access to good ideas. And unfortunately, good ideas are a lot harder to come by than good experiments.
But you know what amazes me? Well, there's two things you said that amazed me. One discouraged me tremendously. One, you found it very heartening to read a book that didn't challenge your beliefs. Well, that was the worst thing you can say about a book, I think. In science, every day we challenge our beliefs. That's how science works. Most people think science works the other way around. But in fact, what you want to do when you come into work every day if you're a scientist is you want to prove all your colleagues are wrong. Because that's the way you get famous. And in fact, the key thing, as Richard Feynman, who I wrote another book about and I've lectured here in Canberra about, would say that, what you try and do if you have an idea, if you're a scientist, is you have a theory and you try and prove it right, but you try and prove it wrong. You try and spend more time proving it wrong. Because, first of all, the easiest person to fool is yourself. It's easy, we all think things happen to us are significant, and Feynman used to go around and say, you won't believe what happened to me today. You just won't believe what happened to me. And people would say, what? And he'd say, absolutely nothing. And because we all believe when something happens to us, it's significant. It has some cosmic significance. You can have 1,000 dreams over many nights. They're nonsense, but you dream one night that a friend of yours is going to break their leg, and the next day they break their arm, and you say, cosmic. You don't realize accidents happen. And so we have to challenge our beliefs every single day. That's what science is all about. There are no scientific ideologies, and in fact, the reason science had progressed and theology hasn't, the reason we have video cameras and lights and medicine and make our lives, and we can feed more people and live longer, healthier lives, is because science changes. The great thing about science is there are no unshakable truths. We force and we don't even believe anything. We force the way we view reality to depend upon the evidence of reality. So if you don't challenge your beliefs, you're never learning. You're never questioning yourself. And so I hope that every student who ever goes to university, at one point in their life, has the opportunity to have something that is at the heart of their being, something so central to their being that if they lose it, they won't feel they're human anymore, to be proved wrong. Because that's the liberation that science provides. The realization that to assume the truth, to assume the answer before you ask the questions, leads you nowhere. And that's why science has led to a modern world where, in fact, we can make progress.
In searching for this elusive final theory, string theory has now become the popular term. But What exactly is string theory?
Well, that's a really good question. I think many physicists are asking themselves the same question, and we're not sure we know the answer. At its heart, string theory really caught on in the 1980s because it's based on this idea that at a fundamental scale, elementary particles are not point-like objects, but rather one-dimensional objects, things that act like strings. Why? Well, it turns out if you allow that to happen, what was discovered was that that theory produced something that looked very much like gravity. And that's what caught people's imagination. Because you see, for most of the 20th century and so far, 21st century, gravity in all other ways has defied quantum mechanics. We tried to take general relativity and merge it with quantum mechanics and we get nonsense. But here was a quantum mechanical theory of a vibrating string that looked like it had gravity in it. So you might have a quantum theory of gravity.
And would it also produce the zoo of fundamental particles that experimentalists were finding?
Well, that's what got people even more excited, because initially you had gravity, and that alone was enough to draw a lot of people's attention. But then as people explored it, well, it turns out that those strings vibrating are only consistent not in 4 dimensions, but it turns out in a lot more dimensions. They got it down to 10 dimensions. After starting with 26, got it down to 10. And so vibrating strings at 10 dimensions would produce in our 4-dimensional world something that looked like gravity. Now you may say, well, that's, a lot of extra stuff for nothing, but it turns out because of those extra dimensions, you also get a lot of extra stuff in the theory. And you might also get not just gravity, but the other known forces in nature, and not just the forces, but the particles. Wow. It looked in 1984 like you might have what, as they called it, a theory of everything. You might explain the entire observable fundamental structure of the universe, forces and particles, with a single idea, and everyone got very excited. And if life were an impressionist painting, then we'd be happy. The trouble is, as we began to explore string theory in finer and finer detail, a lot of the excitement, a lot of the hope, in some sense, has evaporated, because the models that looked like they might explain the 4 forces in nature and 3 families of elementary particles, those models, we realized, were not particularly good approximations to string theory. And then it turned out there were a bunch of different string theories, not one. And if you want to have a theory of everything, you hope it's unique, right? So there were a bunch of different ones, but they were discovered, well, they're actually all different manifestations of a single theory. Great. But not a single theory in 10 dimensions, a single theory in 11 dimensions. A theory called M theory. We don't know what M stands for, but it's called M theory.
What's one more dimension?
Yeah, but in this case, it turns out when you have that extra dimension and that theory began to be investigated, it turns out that strings themselves may not be the fundamental objects after all, just like particles weren't in 4 dimensions. Strings may themselves be an illusion. It turns out the dominant, most important things may have been things that weren't even known about in 1984, things called brains, like membranes. A three-dimensional universe would be like a 3-brain, 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions, 6 dimensions, and the dynamics of those things make the theory almost infinitely more complicated. And what's been discovered is that perhaps this theory may have nothing to do with reality, but even worse, maybe it does have something to do with reality, and there's no possible way for us to make a connection between that abstract idea in 11 dimensions. It's really not even yet a theory. It's an idea in search of a theory, because it's so complicated that we're realizing, for example, that it might not predict a single kind of universe like our own, but perhaps 10 to the 500 universes. And that can be viewed as a success or a failure depending upon how you're looking at it. If you can predict a universe that has any different properties you could ever measure, then that's like predicting nothing at all, right? Because if your theory is consistent with anything I can measure, then it's not falsifiable. It's more like philosophy than physics. If I can't prove it wrong, then I don't know if it's real.
But that doesn't mean it's not real.
That doesn't mean it's not real. The worst thing would be that if it's real and we couldn't prove it.
Well, I don't know why. I don't think that's the worst thing. If it's real, even if you can't prove it, accept it.
Well, how do you know it's real? I mean, maybe maybe instead of particles being made of strings, they're made of pink elephants. I mean, if you can't disprove the idea, then from a physics perspective, it's impotent. And if it's impotent, you ultimately end up throwing it out. I've said that string theory is the least successful great idea of the 20th century because it's been 30 years that it's been worked on by really smart people, thousands of them. And progress has been made, but we still haven't answered any fundamental physical questions about the universe. And we haven't shown that we can falsify it. But some string theorists have recently taken this idea of 10 to the 500 universes as a great success. Because as we look out at the universe, we've discovered it's kind of crazy in a number of different ways. There's certain properties like dark energy and other things that are completely inexplicable. Some people have said maybe there's really no fundamental explanation of why the universe must be the way it is.
Unique.
No unique
necessary.
It may just be an accident. Physics may be an environmental science. Our universe could be one of an infinite number of universes, in each one of which the laws of physics is different. And we live in our universe because our universe allows life. It's called the anthropic principle.
Very controversial.
It's very controversial and to some physicists very disgusting. But to string theorists, it seemed like the Holy Grail because it was a great resonance. Because here you had this theory that couldn't explain anything. And now you have this universe that may not be explainable. And the two work together very well because string theory has produced what they call the landscape. If there are 10 to the 500 universes, you have a natural landscape in which this idea of the anthropic principle can flourish. But the problem is, in some sense, you've gone from, instead of having a theory of everything, to a theory of anything, which some people would say is equivalent to having a theory of nothing. And we just don't know.
These are very serious matters, and they're not to be laughed off by references to the occasional work of Catholic charities. But I draw your attention not just to the apologies, ladies and gentlemen, but to the evasive and euphemistic form that they take. Joseph Ratzinger, the current Pope, considered by some, by Catholics, to be the Vicar of Christ on earth, says of Indians, of the Indians who were massacred in the course of conversion in Brazil, after the apology had been made to them, he said, nonetheless, it must be remembered that before we came to convert them, they were silently awaiting the arrival of the church. I don't think that's a very genuine kind of apology to you. In his comment, one of the few he's made on the institutionalization of rape and torture and maltreatment of children in Catholic institutions, he has said, it's a very severe crisis which involves us, he said, in the following: in the need for applying to these victims the most loving pastoral care. Well, I'm sorry. They've already had that. And to say that this is the responsibility laid upon you by the horrific admission that you've already had to make is not accepting responsibility in any adult sense. When I say child abuse was institutional, how dare I say so? How can I prove it? How can I prove such a thing? Well, I'll ask His Grace, and I'll ask Anne Widdecombe. Where is Cardinal Bernard Law now? Where is he? Where is the Cardinal Archbishop of Boston, whose resignation was indignantly demanded, finally, by 50 members of the Church and by the whole laity of Massachusetts, who also demanded his prosecution for the promotion and protection and covering up and apology for and defense of people whose crimes against children are too revolting to specify. And he's not in the jurisdiction of Massachusetts now, as perhaps you know. He's the Supreme Vicar of the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, personally appointed by the Pope to that as well as many other important sinecures. And in 2005, this man, a fugitive from justice and from complicity in the filthiest crime that it's possible for a human being to imagine, was one of those voting in conclave to decide who the next Vicar of Christ on earth will be.
Question for Dr. Cherry.
All right. It won't take a minute to ask. I don't just support and try and help out those who dissent from the ridiculous belief of Christianity and the horrible idea of vicarious redemption. In other words, the idea that by watching another person suffer, an innocent person suffer, that you could be freed not just from your debts or your sins, but your responsibilities. You could cast your sins on a scapegoat. I don't just oppose that disgusting belief. I oppose the Judaism from which it's plagiarized and the Islam that plagiarizes from it. And I give publicity and exposure whenever I can to those who were brave enough in old times to oppose this nightmarish belief. And one of the great opponents of the Islamic totalitarianism in ancient Persia was the great Omar Khayyam, perhaps the greatest poet of old Persia, whose Rubaiyat, I'm sure, is known at least to some of you. And my favorite verse of this comes from the Robert Le Gallienne translation, and it takes the form of a question. The quatrain is in the form of a question. It says, "And do you think that unto such as you, a maggot-minded, starved, fanatic crew, God gave a secret and denied it me? Well, well, what matters it? Believe that too." To this magnificent astronomer and scientist and physician and humanist of Persia, who opposed the cruel, sadistic, verminous, ignorant mullahs of his day, I borrow the question, what is your authority for saying that you know something that I don't?
Christopher, I'm giving a probability argument. As you said before, you can't disprove the existence of God, and you can't prove beyond any doubt that there's a God. I'm giving probability. I'm giving cosmological, teleological, moral, consciousness, reason, mathematics, all of those things I listed before. It's open, the evidence is open to everybody. And this is related to your 70,000 years point that you just made there. From a Christian perspective, God has always had a revelation, even before Christ. It talks about the fact that God has always had a witness. There's three witnesses. There's creation. Everyone has creation. There's conscience. Everyone has conscience. And there's Christ. Now, Christ, true, only came 2,000 years ago. But his sacrifice of atonement
is the highest principle that the human intellect can use to ennoble our existence. You can applaud for that. That's his. On a personal level, whenever I spent an evening with Hitch, I came away saying, when I grow up, I want to be an intellectual. The moment you entered his house, you were overwhelmed by a single obsession, books. Books were everywhere, on every surface, on the wall, on the floors, on couches, on tables, and bathrooms. But unlike for many of us, myself included, the books on Christopher's wall were far more than window dressing. They were arranged according to subjects and ideas in a way that made it clear that the books were regularly read, all of them, and consulted, that the knowledge contained within them was used in a sense that few of us really adequately exploit. It was humbling to witness close up an intellect that was so capable of surrounding any subject, relishing it, exploring it for its own sake, critically soaking up everything that's worth. That stupidity, prejudice, superstition, hatred, power, and money generally win. But it doesn't matter. You can't give up. But that was that second feature, that unadulterated joy of ideas in the human experience, the need for irony and humor, and the recourse to the full banquet of human knowledge and culture that set Hitch apart from so many of the rest of us. Charm and wit, when combined with actual knowledge, is not to be underrated. Since his death, I've been told by many people that that's the greatest loss to the cause of reason that brings all of us here today. I have to say personally, that's what guides me. I remember on the day he died, I told myself that to whatever small extent I could emulate any of those qualities in my own work, to keep the candle of joy and wonder and irony that he kept burning, I dedicate my life to that task. And knowing he was ever ready to incorporate this wisdom to shed light on old ideas or critically examining new ones with the full weight of a lifetime of intellectual exploration combined with the playful and curious excitement of a child in a candy store. He embodied the delicious possibilities of existence and the profound sense of satisfaction that intellectual exploration, integrity, and bravery can bring, especially when confronting power with knowledge, even as he openly recognized that the possibility of a successful outcome in any such battle is always slim. Those are the two features that were most crucial to what I admired about the man. It takes courage to speak out against injustice and ignorance wherever you see it, no matter whose sensibilities you ruffle. But it takes far more courage to do that when you realize that the odds are overwhelming that you will lose. I'm going to depart from my normal procedure, which is to not prepare remarks, because I like not to know what I'm going to say. But Hitch was too important to give out random words, so I've actually prepared some remarks. Christopher Hitchens was my friend. And even as I say those words, I'm amazed. Every time I used to leave his apartment, usually pretty drunk, I'd walk out the door in amazement and I'd say, Christopher Hitchens is my friend. What did I do to deserve this? Why on earth would he want to spend time with me? Shortly after his death, I was interviewed on CNN by a cloying and annoying interviewer who tried to suggest that she was intimately familiar with him by calling him Chris on every occasion. And if you knew anything about Christopher, you knew that he'd immediately tell you his name was not Chris. Anyway, I just forced myself to watch it to see how she introduced him. And she said, on the one hand, he inspired the ideals of skepticism, free inquiry, and rational thought in many. But at the same time, he has been called a bullying, lying, opportunistic, cynical contrarian. And she said that as if it was a bad thing. Christopher was a beacon of knowledge and light in a world that constantly threatens to extinguish both. He had the courage to accept the world for just what it is and not what he wanted it to be. That's the highest praise I believe one can give any intellect. He understood that the universe doesn't care about our existence or our welfare, and he epitomized the realization that our lives have meaning only to the extent that we give them meaning. For Christopher, this came through the credo that guided his life, the courageous defense of the simple proposition that skepticism, rather than credulity,